Breaking news, Raider Nation. The silver and black have just shaken up the roster in a way that nobody saw coming. Major trades, surprising cuts, and a quarterback switch that's raising eyebrows across the league. Stay locked in because what I'm about to reveal could change the outlook of this season. This is my final 53-man roster projection for the Raiders, and trust me, there are some shocking decisions ahead. At the end, I'll also break down how I see the practice squad shaping up. Now, let me be clear. This isn't necessarily the roster I would choose, but rather the one I believe Pete Carroll and John Spytek are building for this team. With all the chaos that went down yesterday, the signing of Amari Cooper and the trade for Kenny Pickett, the Raiders' front office showed they're not afraid to make bold moves. And with roster cuts looming, every decision matters. But before we dive into the latest roster updates, make sure to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and don't forget to ring the bell icon so you never miss breaking Raiders news. The Raiders' quarterback room just got a shakeup. The late-night trade for Kenny Pickett cost them a fifth-round pick, a price some consider steep. But here's the twist. Because of the Nate Hobbs situation and compensatory picks, the Raiders are essentially swapping one fifth-rounder for another. And what does that mean for Aiden O'Connell? The harsh truth, he's not sticking around. Pickett is the clear upgrade at QB2, and the staff believes they can unlock his full potential, just as they've done in the past with guys like Geno Smith and Baker Mayfield. Reports suggest the Raiders will likely move forward with an injury settlement for O'Connell, rather than carrying him on IR for the season. It's a tough break, but it's the reality of building a competitive roster. And this is only the beginning. With 20 players still needing to be cut before the team gets down to 53, we're about to see even more fireworks in the coming days. Stay tuned, because every move tells us exactly how this front office is shaping the future of the Raiders. After the decision on Aiden O'Connell, the Raiders turn to the running back room, and this one comes with some tough choices. Chris Collier has already been shown the door, which means the real battle is between Dylan Lobb, Sincere McCormick, and Raheem Mostert for those final depth spots. The top of the chart feels locked in. Ashton Genty and Zamir White. Genty has flashed explosiveness that this team desperately needs, while White's physical, downhill running style looked every bit as dominant in preseason. He earned that nickname Zeus for a reason. Behind them, I see the Raiders keeping Raheem Mostert for his speed and ability to contribute in the passing game. As for the final slot, Dylan Lobb gets the nod over McCormick, not because McCormick lacks talent, but because Lobb adds a critical element on special teams, and roster spots this year are too valuable to ignore versatility. Now let's shift to the wide receiver room, where things get really interesting. The Raiders made headlines with the signing of Amari Cooper on a one-year deal worth up to $6 million. On paper, it's a fair contract for a player who can still produce at a high level. But here's where the tension rises, Jakobi Meyers. Despite doing everything right this offseason, he's still waiting on an extension, and frustration is starting to build. His recent trade request wasn't about leaving Las Vegas for the sake of it. It was about respect, about saying, pay me what I've earned, or send me somewhere that will. If the Raiders were to move him for someone like Kyle Duggar in a straight-up deal, it would be a disaster, franchise-altering in the worst way. Think Luka Doncic for Anthony Davis levels of regret. That's how badly this could backfire. For now, I'm keeping Myers on the roster. In fact, I see the Raiders carrying 6 receivers in total. Cooper joins the room, but his addition feels less like a plan to replace Myers and more like an insurance policy, especially considering Tommy Mellett's slow development. Mellett remains more of a project than a polished weapon. The wide receiver room is one to watch closely. Whether Myers stays long-term or forces the team's hand, this storyline will keep heating up. With 6 wide receivers locked in, the attention now shifts to the tight end room, and this one feels more straightforward than most. Yes, Albert Okwuegbunam flashed in spurts, and yes, Carter Wren's journey is a great story that you'd love to see continue on the practice squad. But when it comes down to the active roster, the Raiders are going with 3 names only: Brock Bowers, Michael Mayer, and Ian Thomas. This decision says a lot about the offensive identity. The Raiders ran more 11 personnel, 3 wideouts, 1 tight end in the preseason than any other team in the league. While fans have been anticipating heavy 2 tight end sets, the reality is this scheme looks built for speed, spacing, and flexibility. Here's the intriguing wrinkle. One league source shared that part of the confidence in possibly moving on from Jacoby Myers stems from how highly the staff views Brock Bowers. They see him as more than a tight end. They see him as a true number one receiving weapon. Put Bowers on the outside, keep Mayer inside as a matchup nightmare, and suddenly you have an offense that doesn't look like anyone else's in the division. Does that mean Myers is gone? Not yet, but the possibility is very real. And the front office has to weigh that risk against the potential upside of letting Bowers become the centerpiece. Now, here's the bigger question. Who's really making these final roster calls? In the past, it was clear. Under Gruden, it was all Gruden. Under McDaniels, it was all McDaniels. But now, with Pete Carroll and John Spytek running the show together, things look different. The best organizations have a balance. The GM controls roster construction, while the coach gets his say in how to use the pieces. Ideally, Carroll and Spytek are working in lockstep. You get one guy, I get one guy. If it were up to me, the final call should belong to the GM. That's his job. Build the roster. The coach's job, maximize it. And speaking of roster construction, that brings us to the next critical unit, the offensive line. This one's going to sting for some players, because with the addition of a sixth receiver, the Raiders no longer have the luxury of carrying 10 linemen. Somebody's going to lose their spot. The offensive line decisions weren't easy, but one notable cut stands out, Lokahi Tosi. Now let's be real, this one hurts. Tosi is raw, but he's a mountain of a man with surprising athleticism for his size. He came into the league as a defensive tackle and is still learning the offensive line craft. That's why I believe the Raiders will stash him on the practice squad under the International Pathway Program. It's a low-risk way to keep developing him without burning a roster spot. Here's the catch, though. If another team takes a closer look, Tosi could end up getting claimed. He has all the tools to eventually become a quality interior lineman. In fact, with the Eagles' fingerprints all over this front office, you can see the connection. Philly did the same thing with Jordan Mailata, turning an inexperienced project into a franchise left tackle. The blueprint is there. So why does Thayer Munford survive the cut? Honestly, the staff just seems higher on him than I am. Despite his inconsistencies, the Raiders clearly value his versatility and experience. Sometimes it's not about upside, it's about trust, and right now they trust Munford more. With the offense settled, it's time to flip to the other side of the ball. And this is where things get tricky. Unlike the offense, which feels relatively stable, the defense still has a ton of unanswered questions. Multiple positions are up for grabs, and yesterday's moves only made things more complicated. When we start breaking down the defensive ends, the real battles emerge. Which edge rushers make the cut? Who gets left behind? That's where the spotlight shifts next. One move I can't get behind is the decision to part ways with Andre Carter. In my eyes, he earned a spot on this 53-man roster. He showed enough to deserve a chance, especially compared to some of the names who did survive the cut. Now about Tonka Hemingway, yes, technically he's more of a defensive tackle, but the Raiders list him at defensive end, so that's where I'm slotting him for now. Realistically, though, expect him to slide inside as part of the rotation. As it stands, I'm keeping 5 edge players, though one of them, Hemingway, will spend plenty of time at DT. What's fascinating is how the Raiders are experimenting with their fronts. In that final preseason game against Arizona, we saw looks with 1 defensive end and 3 tackles, and then on the next series, a 5-man front with Crosby, Wilson, and Coons all on the field together. This staff is clearly committed to mixing and matching personnel, whatever it takes to keep offenses guessing. Moving to the interior, I absolutely love the trade for Thomas Booker. Next to Adam Butler, he immediately becomes one of the best defensive tackles on this roster. And don't be surprised if, in a year or two, he's the top guy at the position. Then there's Lucky Fotu. He's finally healthy, out of the walking boot, and back in the mix. That left me with a tough call between him and Zach Carter. Truthfully, I could have gone either way. Carter showed enough to stick, and if the team decides to keep him over someone like Charles Snowden, I wouldn't bat an eye. But for now, my count leaves me with 10 defensive linemen overall. Now let's shift to the linebacker room. The Raiders have already moved on from Amari Gaynor and Jalen Smith, trimming down the competition. The core group feels locked in. Jamal Adams, Jermaine Pratt, Landon Roberts, and Devin White. Where things get interesting is the back end of the depth chart. It really comes down to Cody Lindenberg, Tommy Eichenberg, and Matt Jones. From what I've gathered, Lindenberg's chances don't look strong at the moment. The coaching staff seems to have a little more faith in Eichenberg's instincts and physicality. Because of that, I see Eichenberg getting the nod here. When it comes to the linebackers, I've decided to keep five. No more, no less. Carrying extra doesn't make sense for this roster because the Raiders desperately need depth in the secondary, and that's where the real questions begin. Let's start with the cornerbacks. Earlier today, Jordan Schultz reported that the Raiders showed interest in Rasul Douglas. But in the end, Douglas chose the Dolphins instead. Honestly, I don't blame him. The Raiders had him once, then moved on, and he's probably never forgotten that. Still, the report at least confirms one thing. Las Vegas is very aware that cornerback is a weakness. And it is a weakness. Darren Porter hasn't looked sharp all offseason. Yokorian Bennett is still developing. And as much as I want to believe in Q Blue Kelly, I'm not sure he makes many 53-man rosters around the league right now. On the flip side, the staff is intrigued by Cameron Richardson. He's raw, but his athleticism pops. Darnay Holmes survives for me, though I wouldn't be shocked if the team swapped him out for Greedy Vance. And honestly, that move would make sense. Vance has improved every single week, the same way Isaiah Mal once did as an undrafted rookie. Betting on growth is sometimes the smartest play. Because of the versatility at safety, I'm only keeping five corners. The Raiders have shown all offseason that they like using safeties in the nickel role, and that flexibility changes the math. Now, speaking of safeties, a few spots feel locked in. Jeremy Chin is a lock. Isaiah Polamau is a lock. Even though Lonnie Johnson Jr. is dealing with an injury, I expect him to stay. After that, it gets tricky. Trey Taylor and Thomas Harper were both in the mix, but Harper's injury slowed his momentum. The most surprising case might be Chris Smith, too. His preseason was rough. He struggled in coverage and didn't look comfortable early. But then, when the pressure ramped up late, he responded. That's the kind of resilience coaches notice. It reminded me of something Pete Carroll has always preached. It's not about never falling. It's about how you respond when you do. Smith proved he could take the hit and bounce back, and for that reason, he earns a place on this 53. So really, the last question comes down to whether Lonnie Johnson Jr. is healthy enough to justify keeping. My gut says yes, and alongside him, I believe Terrell Edmunds will also stick. That rounds out the safety room, and with it, the Raiders' secondary. When it comes to the safety room, the decisions weren't simple. We've seen multiple players rotate through, filling different roles depending on game situations. Lonnie Johnson Jr. spent much of the offseason in that big nickel spot, essentially a hybrid role between safety and linebacker. That's also where Terrell Edmunds fits in. Then there's Chris Smith. He's a name worth watching because he's flashed at times, but the front office could decide to move on from him if they look outside the roster after final cuts. For now, I'm keeping him. He's shown enough resilience and versatility to earn one of those final safety spots. Special teams, of course, remain straightforward. Daniel Carlson, A.J. Cole, and long snapper Jacob Bob Moyer are locked in. But the return game is where decisions ripple through the rest of the roster. Ray Tucker stays, not just because of his speed as a receiver, but because of what he brings as a returner. That role keeps him safe. Players like McCormick and Bachman, unfortunately, I don't see them cracking the final 53 because the staff values Dylan Lob's all-around special teams ability. So when the dust settles, my 53-man roster is set. But let me be clear, this is one of the hardest days in the NFL calendar. Dozens of players give everything they have, and not everyone gets to stay. For me, the toughest cuts came down to names like Alex Bachman, Will Putnam, Cody Lindenberg, Zach Carter, Thomas Harper, Greedy Vance, and yes, even Loke Itosi. All of them fought hard, and I genuinely wrestled with those decisions. But that's the reality of roster building. It's never easy, and it's never perfect. Next up, we'll dive into the practice squad projection, which brings its own set of challenges. You can't just stash every talented player you cut, because once they hit waivers, other teams can swoop in. Key is balancing upside with availability, and that's exactly what I'll break down next. When you think about building a roster, The practice squad is where strategy really comes into play. It's not just about keeping extra bodies around, it's about developing the right guys for the future. The league allows 16 practice squad spots, but thanks to the International Pathway Program, the Raiders can carry 17. And that bonus slot feels tailor-made for Lokahi Tosi. He's still raw, still learning, but his size and upside make him a no-brainer stash. Now here's the wrinkle. 10 of those practice squad spots have to go to players with 2 or fewer seasons of experience. It forces teams to think young, to develop players who might not be ready today, but could be contributors tomorrow. If I'm Pete Carroll and John Spytek, I'm leaning into that rule. Build depth. Build for the future. That's why on offense, I only kept 7 players. I'm simply more confident in that side of the ball. The names: Sincere McCormick, Shedrick Jackson, Alex Bachman, Quadier Ishmael, Carter Renan, Will Putnam, and Dalton Wagner. Dawson Tosi as the international slot, and technically the offense holds 8. On defense, the priority shifts. Andre Carter is the clear headliner to bring back, while John Joyner and Cody Lindenberg offer valuable developmental depth. And take note of Zach Carter, one of the rare veterans with more than 2 years in the league who earns a spot. He's the type of rotational piece you can elevate on game days when the trenches get thin. One interesting situation is Trey Taylor. I've heard from sources close to him that other teams, including the Baltimore Ravens, have already shown interest. So it's very possible he doesn't circle back to Las Vegas. That's the reality of roster juggling in the NFL. You can't keep everyone. So when the dust settles, that's the Raiders' practice squad blueprint: young players to mold, a few veterans to stabilize, and a project like Tosi who could grow into something special. It's not glamorous, but this is how smart franchises quietly build staying power for the long haul.